Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies. What usually are our Monday studies. We're a day late on this one, traveling back from California and had some complications. So sorry for the delay in this. I'm still going to put it up as a Monday study, even though it carried into Tuesday and late in the day as it is. But we're going to complete the book of Ecclesiastes today. And because of the complications, I haven't really put together something that we would do in the sense of the apologetics, but I will have a little tag on to the end of this about kind of the closing thoughts that he has here in this book. And they're pretty intriguing, and frankly, they do. I know I've been kind of looking at this as kind of how cynical this book sounds, and yet there is an interesting kind of an aspect to it, and it's really, I've mentioned it a number of times, the futility that you see in this. It seems as though there's almost a frustration in him, but at the same time, there is in his reasoning of this, there is the realization of the very temporary aspect of life, and that comes through very, very clearly. It's obvious that he's really kind of contending with that in this, and for people that are older in age, this last chapter really has a very good summary in two different ways. There is that cycle that you've heard him mention quite a bit of life and youth versus the aged. And then at the end of it, in the last couple of verses, it really is as general of a summary as you're going to be able to find pretty much in anything. If you're listening to a person who's having something to say in the Bible as a writer, there are times that you'd like to say, what would you say if you're just going to boil it all down and just give me a couple of very brief words? And he really does summarize that incredibly well. And interestingly enough, this I've mentioned a number of times as well. What he would have at his fingertips of what we would consider the written word of God is very, very minimal compared to ours. And so, yet the conclusion that we would basically get to, myself as a pastor in the 21st century, and he's basically at this point, he's 10 centuries BC. So he's 3,000 years ago, and I would summarize the entirety of the Christian experience and as the believer in the 21st century with really pretty much the same summary. So we will get to that in due course. But what we have here in these opening verses. Again, they're viewed differently by different people, but he uses a lot of allegory, what people might call allegory or symbolism, metaphor, for what it's like to go through the transition from being youthful into the aged. And he uses a lot of language here that could be considered as really just kind of literal or figurative, and I'll give you some of the examples of that. Some of it seems to be pretty clear what he intends by it, and other parts of it are really kind of left up to, I guess you could almost say, the interpretation of the person who's reading it and looking at it, what exactly he means. And again, it may very well have been written very much in an open-ended sense that a different person could look at it and see the imagery perhaps that's here as being literal or figurative. And so it really has left itself open to some interesting interpretation by people. Again, because the original language provides for a couple of different options when you look at the things that he has said here. But if we step back from it, it really is intended to say there is a way that a youthful person looks at the world, because everything is kind of in front of them. As an aged person, you would be looking at life, kind of looking back at it. And I do understand the kind of the frustration that's here. And I do really believe the more that I've looked through this and the more that I've read through it in the years, and especially this time through, there does seem to be kind of a recognition by Solomon here that the things that he says in Ecclesiastes have a real resemblance to what you also see in Proverbs. In Proverbs. And I'm not one who really doubts whether or not it is Solomon who writes both. I think it's pretty internally consistent, the things that you see in Proverbs and the things you see here in Ecclesiastes. And even as we'll see in the last verses here, where he refers to as my son. And the question is this really kind of a teacher versus a pupil? literal kind of an understanding of my son? Or, is it in the most literal sense, being written to son or sons? You saw that very consistently in Proverbs. And so we see it a little bit here also in Ecclesiastes. But it really is written as in the way of instruction. So we'll kind of break that down as we go through it. And I'll have a kind of a summary of my own at the end of this, because it's a very intriguing book as we've gone through it. Hopefully it has been for you as well. But going through it, you can see that there's some very, very interesting things. And again, I kind of take the view of this as I read through it, that there is some frustration in him, because it just seems like there's this never-ending cycle of things. And, at the end of it all, we can look at this and say, but even with all of this really wasn't God's intent. There wasn't supposed to be this cycle of life and death. God did not introduce that. And so we'll get to that as we close today. Just kind of, again, some closing thoughts on this. Very quickly, I spoke with our tour guide yesterday, or not tour guide, but the tour agency that we use for our trips to Israel, and kind of going through some last minute things, and they're getting ready to purchase the airline tickets for the people that need them, which is just my way of saying that our trip to Israel is really kind of at that point now where we're going. And we have not been able to say that for the last year and a half. And I genuinely hope that if you're listening to this and maybe you've had some questions about it, the safety aspect or whatever else, honestly, if you're listening to the stuff here in the States, and if you're listening to kind of mainstream media and whatnot, and the concerns about what's happening in Gaza, you're not getting the story. You're not getting what's really happening there. And again, I have no intention of going if I felt that there was a safety issue. And so if it's something that you've considered going and are wondering whether or not this would be a good time to go or sometime later, again, that's ultimately your decision. But if you're going to stay home because you're concerned about security issues, you should probably at least contact me, and I'll be happy to talk with you by phone or through email. I can kind of go through what we're going to be looking at as far as the trip is concerned. And again, I have every intention by getting on the plane of coming back, unless the Lord returns and picks us up before we come back, hopefully the day that we're supposed to fly out, and I can avoid the plane trip home, because I don't like being on planes that long. I'm not afraid of what happens in them. I just can't stand it. I'm too impatient to sit on a plane, but it's the price that you pay for going. And so it's worth it by the time that you get there, all that, being in the air that long and wanting to just be there. I'm the 4-year-old in the back seat just asking if we're there yet. So it's just my impatience rather than any kind of fear. But anyhow, if you have interest in that, please contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net. And there's a contact us page. You can send me an email. If you're a show subscriber, wonderful. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're not a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. Mainly that's to let you know when content is going up, but also that it gets the more people that are watching, it just helps with the exposure. And my intention all along, and from the day that I started this over 5 years ago here in Texas, is to just work through the entirety of the Bible, Old and New Testament. Again, if you're new to the program, or maybe this is the first time that you're seeing anything, just know that we on Thursdays also go through the New Testament, and we are currently in the Gospel of Matthew. We have started the New Testament again. We had completed the book of Revelation. Now we've come back to the beginning, and so we work through the entirety of the Bible, all the books. After this, we will go through the Song of Solomon, and then we get into to the major prophets, starting at Isaiah. So Ecclesiastes, final chapter, chapter 12, and been looking forward to this chapter because of the simplicity of the last couple of verses. But getting here has taken a bit of a trek, and there's a lot of very interesting things that we have seen in this book. And it comes to kind of a fruition today. It comes to an end, and we summarize the book. So Solomon here, I believe, again, the writer, Solomon, just kind of puts the last parts of this together. And I think it's important that we do address the idea of the cycle of life, the idea of youth. And as I've said, everything is looking forward. From the aged, everything is looking kind of back. And as he says these things, it's pretty obvious that he's getting to the point of the end of life. So the idea of youth, when everything is before you, as opposed to the person who's kind of come to an end of things, and it's that, looking at your youth, that take the time to invest, as he would put here, in the relationship that you have with God, knowing that ultimately we all stand before him, and that's how he ends this. So let's have a word of prayer. We'll take a look at the text, and there's a lot that's before us here. So, Father, we thank you again for being able to come before you in your word, and the comfort and the peace that it gives to the person who believes. We know that this is something that the world fears very much, the idea of the end of life. But to somebody who has put their trust in you, there is no fear in this. And so we pray that you would help us in our understanding to make sense of what it is that's being said here, making application to our own life, and that we could also share the confidence that we have in you because of what you've done, and that when this life is over and we see you face to face, there is no fear. You've given so much more information to us that we could know. And we rejoice in this. We give you all thanks, and we pray that you would guide this study, that the Holy Spirit would open our eyes of understanding, and our hearts and minds would be able to grasp the importance of what's put here before us. So we give to you all thanks and praise, and ask that you would be pleased with all that has taken place in the study of this book. And once again, we make the proper application to what we read. We give to you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so when we read these what people again would refer to as allegory, or metaphor. There's different ways that people look at it, and those words, allegory, metaphor, they're very similar, but it's really where he's trying to use something to illustrate a point. And really what he's getting at here is that there is the idea of youth, and his point here is that remember God in your youth, because the time's going to come when everything is not before you, but everything is really looking back at things. And then ultimately, whether it's the youth or whether it's the aged, we all stand before God someday, and we give account, and he stands as judge. And that's not supposed to be a fearful thing. If you don't know him, it will be a terrifying thing, but by that time it's too late. But to the believer, we've been told that this is coming, and that when we see him face to face, it is not something to be feared. It is something to be embraced and welcomed, because he is seen to eternity, and the temporary things of this life are nothing compared to what is actually before the believer. And Paul tells us that. It's found in a number of places, but the things that are being reserved in glory for us are not even worthy of the troubles that we go through here in life. That's the Romans 8:18 passage. So it's just an interesting summary to what he has said. Now, again, my own personal view of this is when he really wanted to make this something that he worked through, the idea of what he ends up seeing as the kind of the cycle of life, and the things that people will busy themselves about, and all of the kind of things with that. There seems like a futility to it, that no matter how hard a person works, there really is ultimately nothing that you can't change the track of and the trajectory of life. It's going to be a finite thing. Every person has a certain amount of days. And again, the Bible really develops this a lot more after Solomon's time. So you could see he was really kind of onto this. But I believe by reading through Proverbs, which were written, I believe, earlier in his life, this is kind of the summary of that stuff. And there is some repetition in the things that he says in Proverbs as opposed to the things in Ecclesiastes. But if you were just reading the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's all that you had for your frame of reference, you don't know much about Solomon, let's say, and you would read this, you would think, this is a guy kind of looking back. He figures at some point he's going to work through everything about life and come to a conclusion. And at this point, as we read it that way, it would give the impression that maybe he just does this at some point later on in his life, where he's had this lifetime to consider things and look back on them. As I read the Proverbs, I kind of picture him working through it at that time too. This was maybe something that was, obviously he becomes king in his adult years, and this would be written, I guess you could say, later on in life, but it may very well have been from a lifetime of examination and of thinking about this. So when did he actually undertake the idea of really kind of working through this stuff? And it could be something that could take a good portion of a person's life to work through, and ultimately still coming to the idea of the futility of it all. So for these early verses in chapter 12, I want to read something without a lot of commentary that kind of helps us to understand what is he getting at in these earlier verses. So when we look at the end of verse 5, it says, "For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. So remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken." At the well. So it gives you that idea. He's talking about the human experience, the human life. And those kind of images there, and the images that are given to us, really kind of help us to know, because the time comes when the person is gone, and even the mourners who had gathered to mourn the death of that person are gone. They've gone back about their business. So he's clearly talking about the human life, the human experience. And he's contrasting it by the youth as opposed to the aged. And then as he summarizes everything, look, everything that God says is what we should honor and think of and consider and walk accordingly, because everybody will stand before him and they'll give account for the things that they've done, the good or bad. So that sounds like something a person would say if they were witnessing to somebody on the streets here today. And so it would be to the whosoever's, we would say the same thing. That ultimately what we should do is what God has asked us to do. And that's really all that man could ever do, because the day will come when we'll stand before him and we'll give account for everything that we've done. It'll be examined, and God is ultimately the judge. So if we understand that as the closing verse, then that really reflects on everything that he says in summary here in chapter 12, but it covers the entirety of the book. And even you could apply it to the passages that you saw in Proverbs as well. Because so much of that is that, look, the wise person does this, the foolish person does that. And he gives the comparisons about you can do the things that the fools do, or you can do the things that the wise person does. And as you examine those things, again, your actions will all come under the scrutiny eye of God himself, the one who will look at the good and the bad and make judgment on it. So really fascinating. And once again, Solomon's writing from his perspective. He is not looking at this and doesn't have the knowledge that the 21st century observer of the Bible has. So much more is known to us now than anything that Solomon could have ever imagined. But there is a real simplicity and wisdom to what he has to say here. And again, let me say this before we look at the text. I am a week and a day away from being a 60-year-old man, and I genuinely understand what he's getting at here. I look at, and I don't say this with any kind of, oh my gosh, it's the end of things, but I do realize that if I could go back and speak to my 15-year-old self, I would have a lot to say, very, very similar to what Solomon says here in his very poetic language. Again, it's translated into English from Hebrew, which he would have originally penned it. But I think that many of the things that he says, I would absolutely agree with him. And the idea that the body begins to really shut down, and it begins to really change quite a bit over time. And so for us, it's a helpful thing to recognize, take what God has put before you and enjoy the days that you have, because they're few when you really stop to think about it. So we can busy ourselves about so many things, and boy, I could take this 100 different directions in much more detail than what Solomon could, because of what we know. And I've been asking, I asked this of my wife recently on our drive out to California. I asked her this question about, if you could go back in your life and start over again, where would it be? And again, I think it would really kind of influence what we would do, because we already have been there. But, what would you like to go back and do again? And, you don't think about that stuff at 18. You're not thinking, boy, I wish I could go back to 9 years old and do that all over again. You're just still, again, it's all right in front of you. But at 60, you start to look back and go, gosh, I'd love to be able to do that all over again. I'd love to go relive that. I'd love to have that youthfulness, that ability to do the things that I want to do. And you can kind of see that Solomon's been at that place looking through this and writing back to this younger person. If it is, son, when he mentions that, is it just pupil and teacher? Is it father to son? Whatever it may be, It's the aged speaking back to the youthful and saying, enjoy your youth while you have it, because it's not going to always be there. And that really is the summary that he begins as he starts to work through this last chapter. But it really is reflective of everything that he's looked back on since he started the writing of this, because he's going to end it very much the way he started it, as we'll see. And again, take into consideration all that he had written in Proverbs, and realize as we started this study, we get from the accounting of his time that for a man who had every conceivable option given to him and every conceivable gift that God could bestow upon a person of ability and wisdom and knowledge and knowing what to do, right versus wrong, he had all of that. And we still see that it says that he loved many women and they turned his heart against the Lord, or from the Lord. And so that would really put a person on a track of trying to just wonder, what is it all worth, and what is this life? There just seems to be a futility, as he expresses it here, from a person who would pretty much know how to work through that, because he really made a lot of mistakes. So with all that as our understanding, let's read what he says in chapter 12, verse 1, where he says, remember now your Creator in the day of your youth. And again, as Solomon would say this, his idea and his understanding of the, quote, Creator is very different from ours. Because if you were to ask Solomon, based on what's been given to him in the writings of Moses and the things that he may have learned from his father, and whatever there was for oral teaching and understanding, things that could have been said to him, once again, we would look at this and say, well, who's our Creator? And the Christian would basically say, based on what we see in John 1, for a good example, in the beginning, there was the Father, there was the Son, there was the Spirit, and it says to us that Jesus was the one through whom the things were ultimately made. Does that make God the Father, as we would say God the Father, does that make him a spectator? And of course not. We would think that it's God as a collective, Father, Son, and Spirit. We're all involved with it. But what we see is that it says all things were created by him, and without him nothing was created that's created. It's verse 3 of John 1:1. But Jesus is the subject of who's there. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. It's speaking of Jesus. How do we know that? Because verse 14 says that Logos, that Word, became flesh and dwelt among us. So Jesus in his physical form we identify him as that Logos, the Word of God. And all things were created by him. So, when we look at this, we would say our Creator, we would look back and say the Father, Son, and Spirit were all working as one in that creation that we see in Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning, Elohim, the plural of God, was creating the things that we see here. So when Solomon says your Creator, to us, it's an expansive thing. Father, Son, Spirit. Looking at what John has to say, he credits Jesus with being the one by whom the things were created, but they were not, Jesus was not some free agent. This was all agreed upon before anything was. This is how things were created. So we get that in Genesis, and John gives us that little bit of detail about the person of Jesus and his involvement in it. So with that, he says, now remember, it's meaning call to mind in your youth. Don't wait until you're old to start thinking about the things of God. But his point is, as you go through your youth and you understand what it is to have life and vitality and have it all before you, don't lose sight of who it is that gave you this. Remember him all the while. It's not, every once in a while think about God. It's rather in a day-to-day kind of a thing, the one who provided it for you. Remember him throughout your youth. Make him part of your life. And as I was having that conversation with my wife, and I think I've mentioned it a few times through our study here, I wish I had come to know the Lord even earlier than I did. I got saved at 20, but I had knowledge of him before that. But man, my junior high and high school days would have been so much better if I had known him and wouldn't have gotten into some of the things that I did. Even my youth, even before that, the things of being a kid, a little child, and then going through grade school and all the rest. Had I known him as I could have, had I been introduced to him in the same way as we introduced our daughter, and from her earliest notion, her earliest recognition rather, she knows only mom and dad as believers and being involved at church and all of that. It's all she's ever known. I didn't know that until I was much later in life in that same way. I believed that he existed, but the idea that through the entirety of your youth until you get into your adult and even your later years, if you have known him all along, that's really what's being said. Bring him to mind throughout your youth. And so remember now your youth, remember now rather your Creator in the days of your youth before and the difficult times. Now, this is where he starts to talk about the extremes. In your youth, remember him before the older part of your age, and your youth turns into your maturity and ultimately into your later years, really ultimately the end. He makes this big, big leap, your youth to your closing days. And that's really what he focuses in on in the middle parts of this, when a person is to the point of age where you don't look at things as a youthful person any longer. So it really starts to turn what some might look at this and go, gosh, this is so dark. It seems so futile. And there seems to be such that, oh my gosh, it's just so, it sounds so grim and so dark. If you really read it, like it can very easily be read. You'll see what I mean. So he says, before the difficult days, and some translations are evil. And the difficult days would just be when your body and all the day-to-day of things begins to change and shut down. You're not doing the things that you did when you were young. You're doing the things of aged people. And so there is the question about what is he exactly getting at in these descriptions, and I'll give you some examples of some of the different views on it. So before the difficult or the evil days come and the years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them, in what? In the days. So it's like, again, when you're young, everything is so exciting. It's new and you can't wait for a new day. Now we're getting to the point. I was talking with people just this week about my 60th. What are you planning on doing for your 60th birthday? It's like nothing. I don't even want to remember that I'm turning 60. I don't want to add another adding another log on the fire. It's just another year to add to the number that's there. And I didn't think that way when I was 15. It's not like, or just any random number. When I was 10 years old, it's like somebody goes, what do you plan on doing? I don't know. Mom and dad are going to throw a birthday party. Maybe I'm going to get a lot of presents and eat cake and ice cream. So you didn't get to that point about, well, it's just another birthday. It's like no big deal. I had one just, it seems like yesterday was last year, and they just accumulate. And so there's just a very different way that we look at this. And Solomon is capturing that. And unlike myself, kind of chuckling at all this, I don't think he's chuckling at it, but I get the point. When you're younger as opposed to when you're older, the older that you get is like, I don't take any pleasure in these getting older days. But really what that should end up doing for us, and I want to be very serious here for a moment, it's still, as much as we should cherish the days of our youth, we should also do the same here. I'm closer to seeing the Lord face to face than when I was younger. And every day I'm closer to that. But that doesn't mean that you shut down. It's like, well, God, how can you use me between now and then? Whatever days I have, how can you use me? And so I would basically say, I'll lead a tour to Israel. I'll take people there. And I'm going to do that in October. And actually, we'll probably do one in the springtime. We're in the planning stages for that. As often as we can do this, this is pouring into the lives of people and then our family and our friends. How is it that we can use the days most beneficial for the sake of God's kingdom and our own lives and witness and testimony and the things that we do? So I don't want to get to the point where it's like, well, only enjoy the days when you're young, but when you're old, just phone it in. There's just nothing to look forward to. And I don't think Solomon's getting there, and I don't want to give that impression either. So hopefully you're giggling along with me, because this can get really depressing if you're reading it the wrong way. So he says, now before the difficult days come and the years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them, in the days, in getting older, there's just not the same, excitement about the day-to-day of things. Now he says, while the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. So there's a couple of ways that this is looked at. Is it like giving their literal light, or that you don't even pay notice of them anymore? Or is this speaking about the window into the life of the person when there's just not the light that's there anymore? So there is disagreement on whether he's just saying when there is no more life in the person, that just the day-to-day cycle of sun and moon and stars, that 24 hours, like just one day after the next, but that comes to an end. Or like when you have clouds and rain, and then you have the cycle again, when the clouds come again and the rain comes again. Sooner or later, that whole cycle comes to an end. And I don't believe he's meaning this in the eschatological sense. And some people would read into it, but it doesn't seem like that's the case here. It's really more just the cycle of things. And really it applies to all of the things that we're seeing when he's using these symbolic terms, or we call them allegory, whatever you want to call them. But as he's working through those kinds of things, there's this cycle. You can count on it. If the sun's up today, it will be up again tomorrow, but in between there will be the nighttime, the moon and the stars. Or if it's the rainy cycle, clouds will show up, rain will come, but clouds will come back again and the cycle will continue. His point is that cycle comes to an end. When those days come and it comes to an end. And then in verse 3, again, this is something that's not necessarily agreed upon by everyone. These next couple of verses, is it speaking about the actual function of the body? Or is it being, in the literal or the figurative sense? So when we read them, you can kind of see how you can say, how can I read this in the literal sense, and how would it apply? And how would it apply in the, the figurative sense? And the question would be, did God want it, intentionally that ambiguous to broaden the way that you'd look at it? And so that would make sense to me, because Solomon doesn't go in and try to explain his analogies here, or his figurative language. And so would you look at it and go, do you mean literally? Or is this kind of using the symbols to, basically symbolize the day-to-day of things? So when you look at verse 3, and it says, now in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim. So there are people that look at this and say these are all metaphors that are being used for the actual human body itself. So the keepers, in this case, the day when the keepers of the house tremble, if that's speaking about the limbs, the hands and all the rest of it, there's the trembling, but that would be the thing that keeps and protects and oversees the well-being of the entire body itself. And some people would say rather the keepers of the house are more the people, the servants, the people that oversee and take care of the day-to-day of the existence of a home. But they get to the place where just the day-to-day of things are troubling to them. It really does seem to fit very nicely with the idea that we're looking at rather the symbols of what is the human body. And so again, we can see this. The elderly, and especially if they have those kinds of neurological things, you could see the trembling of the hands that didn't used to be there. There was the steadiness, but now there's the trembling. So if he's using all of this imagery to say, using these images to more describe what happens to an aging person, a body, then it would be the strong man that bows down. So used to have that vigor of the younger life, but doesn't have the same strength and vitality. And there is the bowing down, just meaning that there isn't the strength that was there once before. And then the grinders cease because they are few. Grinders can very easily be speaking about teeth in this case. And you could actually have the people who would mill and grind the wheat. Mainly, it was a female's job in those days. So, there are people that would try to make a case for either or it could be both. So are the grinders, is it speaking about the teeth? If it's, again, if Solomon has in mind only things that would be of the human body and using symbols to try to explain to us, okay, the keepers would be the hands, that they would be the ones that would be trembling. The strong man used to be full of vitality, but not as strong as used to be. And so that idea of conceding, and I'm no longer what I used to be. The grinding, if it's the teeth, you start to lose them, or they start to lose their ability. And there's just not as much of a way of working through the idea of eating and chewing and all the rest of it? Or again, is it speaking of grinders that you have in mind, the idea of milling of wheat and grain? And the next verse speaks about people who grind as well, and we'll get there in just a moment. So he says, and then those who look through the windows, they grow dim. And if the windows are being used as a symbol of the eyes, your eyes don't work as well as they used to. Now, in both ways, going to California and coming back, I was driving at night and I was the one driving. And yeah, my eyes are not what they used to be. They get fatigued and they get tired much more than they do. I don't have trouble reading signs. I don't have trouble of knowing where I'm going. But I do notice that at night, yeah, my eyes fatigue quite a bit more. They're more sensitive to light, all that stuff. Just again, they're getting older. The dimness is there, that it's just they don't function as well as they used to. Or is it speaking about the people who sit and they look out in windows and that they're just not there as they used to be? They don't see what they used to. They kind of move away from just the observation of day-to-day things. So what does Solomon mean by this? Does he mean the literal, or is he using it figuratively? You can make a case for both, and maybe that's, again, intentional, that it makes you really broaden the way that you look at it. That there are the idea of the people who would go to the mill, but they're not there anymore. There just aren't as many as there used to be. The people who used to be the ones who cared for the house are no longer there. Everything is getting into this place of disrepair, and it's changing. And really, aside from which side is right, if they're arguing that it's one side or the other, the big picture is that it's a break in the continuity of things. Things will not always remain as they have been. And that's what he's really trying to get in this whole thing. So for us, as we look at this is really his whole purpose for this, is to look at life and trying to figure out that what he saw is this futility and this cycle that just never ends. And there's just this going away from youthfulness to age, and then that really kind of life comes to an end. And he's said this a number of different times, and it does seem to have a very fatalistic view to it. And that's only if there's an end of life and there's nothing more. And fortunately, he says a very penetrating thing in the last couple of verses, so we'll get there. Now he says in verse 4 again, when the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of the grinder is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low. So again, is this meaning what it would look like in a city that would be functioning, but then making the application to this is what it's like in the life of the individual? And so, again, if it's literal or figurative, it's going to depend a little bit on how you read it and what you believe he's trying to get across. Again, we're not told here, and really the language doesn't settle it satisfactorily. So even if you read scholars on this, there's difference of opinion on this. So when we just read it in the plain English, once again, when the doors are shut in the streets. So if this is looking at a city, it's the end of the day, and it's the end of whatever the cycle is, and you shut the doors. It's not open for business the same way that it used to be. So again, if this is speaking more in the figurative sense, if it's talking again about the eyes or just the actual exchange of day-to-day life, an older person tends to be much more shut in and not going out and doing the things that they used to do. So again, literal or figurative, we don't want to get so stuck in the minutia of trying to settle it. This is exactly what he means. If we get into that argument of it, we're missing the big picture. It's the cycle that finally comes to a different conclusion than it used to. In youthfulness, there was no dimming. There was no, slowing down of the day-to-day. Everything was before them, and everything was acceptable and good and exciting. And this is what he's getting to. There's a time when that kind of changes. So, and the sound of grinding is low. Now, if again, we're looking back at the teeth, I'm more inclined to think in these verses he's talking about just the day-to-day of a societal type of a thing. There's a time in the day when the doors end up getting shut. The people that might be milling and doing all that stuff's not happening anymore. The people who were doing that work during the day, they take their break for night. When one rises up at the sound of a bird. This is happening with me too. And we know this if we have kids. When they're really young, it seems like they can sleep through everything. When we're older, man, once something wakes you up, it is hard to get back to sleep. When you're a kid, it's hard to wake them up. when we're old, it's hard to go back to sleep when we've woken up. So is that what's meant here by the idea of one rises up at the sound of a bird, or something that would seemingly not be an issue? It wakes you up and, okay, I am up, so I'm up. And I don't remember in my youth waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning for whatever reason and not being able to go back to sleep. So you just get up for an hour or two and then go back to bed later. That's happened to me, over time. Now, interesting, it's happening now more that I'm out here in Texas because I don't have the same 9 to 5 that I used to have back in California. So who knows? Maybe I've sealed my own fate in this by moving out and getting away from all the busyness. I say that in jest. I love being able to do this at my pace. So he says this, now, and all the daughters of music are brought low. So all of the festivities, the things happening, they come to an end, and if it's at the close of the day. If that's what's being intended here in a societal sense, the day's events are come to a close, nighttime has come, and all of those things slow down, but the cycle will come back around. So again, he's using it, even if it's meaning societally, he's still trying to use the metaphor of it. Our human lives, the existence of every single person is on that cycle. Things are going on, and then they slow down. And so when he turns to verse 5, also they are afraid of height and terrors in the way. So again, the idea of going to places elevated for fear of tripping and falling, coming back down. Again, when I'm 18 or 15 or 10 or whatever else, you go pretty much wherever. You didn't have the fear of going up into a higher place because you didn't have to worry about getting back down. I remember being up on the roof of our house. I didn't worry about jumping off the roof and landing on the grass. You just jump down, tuck and roll, and that was it. I'm at 60. I wouldn't do that now. I'm afraid of what would happen when I landed. I'm not as spry as I used to be. So again, also the being afraid of height and the terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper is a burden and desire fails. So again, there's a lot of different questions about this. Is he using, see again, the almonds blossoming doesn't seem to fit necessarily, unless it is, again, about it has its growing season and it's the end of the growing season. The blossoms happen and the almonds, come to fruit. They're going to go away until the next year's harvest. If he's using it as a metaphor for people, look at my hair, it's gray. If that's the case, and he's referring to the blossoming of the almonds, that's the changing of the color. If that's what he's using, I understand it in both senses. If he's using about the cycle of the tree producing fruit and blossoming and everything else, it's not always in that case. There's a cycle to it. So if it's the same thing where he says here, and the grasshopper is a burden, some people see that as even the weight of a grasshopper on your arm is like, it's putting pressure. And he's using, that would be an extreme, almost an absurd example of, it wouldn't even be noticed before, but even the weight of a grasshopper is a big deal. I don't know about, how to make this one work, or, that you're troubled by the fact that one is there when you wouldn't even take notice of it before. Or, as he says here, the second part of that, and desire fails. Even the things that you used to really look forward to and have a desire for them, you're kind of, I'm not excited about it, those things like they used to be. And every person is different. But if you're young listening to this, you probably haven't gotten to this point with many things, but I do know that there used to be things that were very important to me on a personal level that just really aren't as much anymore. So again, I kind of get where he's going with this. So for a man, here's the important part, and I already read this. For a man goes to his eternal home, death, what happens after death, and Solomon's understanding of it is different from ours. Let's remember that. So we would know so much about the eternal, far, far more than he could have ever known, because God hadn't revealed as much that we know of, certainly nothing like ours, because we're after Jesus has gone to the cross. We know what the forgiveness of sin is, and we know the eternal in ways that he could not have known. It wasn't simply revealed to him like it's been revealed to us. But his point is, the man goes to his eternal reward. He dies, his eternal home. He's dead, and this is even after those who mourned him at his funeral, at the time spent together, and the death process and the mourning process for that person's death went on for days. So it's much different than what we have now. But the point is, this person has seen the entirety of their life. They've gone on to their eternal, wherever it is, that their life is over. And even the people who mourned for them have gone back on with their life. So he says in verse 6, remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. So the second part of this we get, the wheel and the vessel. If you're going to draw water from a well, if those things are broken, there's no way to draw water. So again, something that's no longer able to function. Going back to the verse right before it, it's the end of life kind of a thing. So, of course, if he's still staying with that same motif of words and everything else, if you went to a well and the wheel that you would use the rope to lower down, if that's broken, the rope's not going to lower down. Or if what you use to draw the water is broken, there's no way to draw water up. You get the picture. The first part of this is one that you see some people kind of disagree on. And so it is the idea of the silver cord being loosed or the golden bowl being broken. And if the bowl is being seen as the thing that would be, the preciousness is used in the silver and the gold, but what's the visual that's being here? Some people go as far as to say it's the head of gold and the spine is the silver, and that just seems like you're reading a lot more into it. But if this is more like thinking in the sense of a lamp, something that would give illumination, and that would be the bowl that would carry the oil and illuminate. But if the cord that holds it in place is broken and they both fall to the ground, there's no illumination. So if that's what's being said, it seems to work really well here. Better than the option as far as I'm concerned, as far as the spine and the head and all that stuff. But again, still, it is that something that has a normal purpose, if it ceases to have that function, then again, it's at the end of its cycle of being useful. And that's more what he's trying to get to here as he gives these descriptions. So he says this, then the dust, when that all takes place, then the dust will return to the earth as it was. Speaking again about the human body. Ashes to ashes, from ashes you came, ashes you return. That's how Adam was created, from the dust of the earth. This is his way of saying that which had all that youthfulness, that newborn child through its younger years and its adolescence and the youthfulness that was there. There's a time when everybody reverts to the same thing. A body will ultimately go back to dust. That's what it turns back into, what it was created from in the first place. And it says the spirit will return to God who gave it. This part he knows, that man will stand before God, and he's going to have more to say that. So now he ends this part, or it's really kind of the summation. This is what you see in chapter 1. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. So this is a repetition of what we see at the beginning in the first verse or two of the chapter, the first chapter. He starts this way and he ends this way. And if we wonder what he means by vanity, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean, just in the most general sense, the idea of a vapor, something that might appear there, but it's not going to be there long. And so vanity just means that there's an emptiness to it. It has a substance, but it's not permanent. It's just empty. It's only there for a while. It's very much on its way out the moment that you see it. So here he says, with all of what he has said, there really is an emptiness to this. And that can be seen in a very cynical sense, but fortunately, he has a lot to say in the spiritual sense. Man goes back to God. And the cycle of life, there is an emptiness to it. It's here, it's fleeting, it's not forever. So he says in verse 9, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, speaking of himself, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. So this, if he's speaking of himself, again, knowing who Solomon was, speaking in Proverbs as he did, and having the wisdom that he had, and really imparting that to others, he's sharing with the audience here everything that he figured in this whole pursuit. Even though there's a lot of emptiness to it, and it really didn't, at times it seems like, yeah, I mean, I've put the pieces together, but it still doesn't make any sense. You could see that there's still a wandering in him. But the things that he could kind of come to an understanding about, and things that he could convey, those are the things that he's conveyed. Whether it's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the things that he has shared, these are the things that he can say, this I know. There's still some things that just they elude me. It's too much for me to try to figure out. I don't have an answer for you. But the things that I can, he says, now because of the wisdom that God has given to me, I wasn't going to keep this to myself. I have given it back out. So he says in verse 10, the preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright words of truth. So everything that he gives us an account here. The wisdom that's been put here, this was my intention to do it. And as he's saying, if this was him looking and saying, my work product that I've put together here, this is the best that I can do. And I believe and stand wholeheartedly behind the things that I've written here. I find them to be valuable and they're truthful. There's no pretense here. This is just my conclusion. So this is him saying kind of a validation of the work. I'm not doing this for any reason other than passing along to you that which I have discovered, and I believe it to be truthful and accurate and important. This is the stuff that should be remembered. Now, you could say a whole lot more. That's what he covers in verse 11. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of a scholar are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. So he's going to have something more to say after this. But here again, this is one of those things where sometimes people read too much into the language. As we see the English here, it seems to make a lot of sense. So he uses two things. A goad would be the things that you would use to steer your beast of burden, your ox. If they're plowing a field, the goads were supposed to keep them on the straight and narrow. So the things that he has put here, he sees them as guidelines, things that would keep you in your lane, if you will. They're like goads. And he says the words of a person, a scholar, they're like driven nails that are driven, and they keep things together. And so if we understand the metaphor that he's using here, a person who's really good at building and putting things together is going to make sure that they're attached and they're together and that they're sturdy, reliable, they're not flimsy, they're put together very well. And this, we get this. The things of what we see in the scripture, we can say that they're incredibly stable. God is the one who's put them together, so of course they stand up under the test. They don't falter, they don't break. They're well driven, they're put together, everything is secure. And the same thing about when God gives direction, and we know that as the Bible would be looked to us as the goad, the thing that would help us and direct us, we're not going to go off of the path that he wants us to if we're being directed by him. Also, if God's the one who's building these things, then we know that it's secure. It's not going to have any kind of a weak point. Because we notice what he says here, but these things, these sayings, they are given by one shepherd. Speaking that Solomon would say, the things that I've given to you, the things preserved here, ultimately God's the author of them. And so I'm not sharing with you, Solomon would say, I'm not sharing with you anything that's just useless opinion or not thought through. This stuff is really carefully considered. So then he says this, and further, my son, by admonition, be admonished by these of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. So the point would be, if somebody was to pick this up, the intended audience, I wanted to work through these things that I feel are very, very important. And so his point was, the things that I've written here are the summary, and they're useful. God's ultimately the author. He's the one shepherd from whom I've received them. Take these as being useful, because if you want to say, well, let's find out what everybody else has to say on the topic, there's no end to it. So you'll make it this pursuit where, okay, you can figure it out on your own if you think, but I've gone there already. So you can take what God has shown me and realize that it's an authentic, useful, good piece, or you can take everybody else's opinion and get confused over the whole thing. So then he has this as the closing point. Let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. And I would say that you could say, beyond just Ecclesiastes, look at everything about Solomon's life. Everything that we know about him, from Proverbs to the things of his kingship, decisions that were made, look at all of it and see this. What's the conclusion of really the life of Solomon? You could say this. It would be to fear God, that is to have reverence, and to keep his commandments. Now remember, this is written by a man who understands the law as given through Moses. So commandments did have a different feel to him than they would to us, though we understand the commandments that he would understand. Those things that God has said as direction. Here's what I expect you to do. We get that. In our understanding, if we're making an application to this, there is so much more direction that's been given to us through the person of Jesus and the writers of the New Testament, in addition to what we see in the Old Testament. But if we wanted to say, let's make application to our time, he's saying the commandments, what God has commanded. We could look back from Solomon's time and say, there are plenty of commandments that we see, not just the 10 that are recorded, but there were many other things that God said, do this, don't do that. Those would be commands. So for the ones that would still be in operation in the New Testament, maybe if you think of moral laws, things that are supposed to be done in the sense of morality and ethical things and all of that, that's still, you'll find that supported in the New Testament. Things that were very much exclusive to a lot of like dietary things and things that were really specific to the law and the priesthood and stuff like that, those things have changed. So what we want to say is everything that we know of the Old and the New Testament, God has given direction or instruction. Those things we want to keep. So fear him, meaning have reverence for God and do the things that he has commanded or given instruction on them. Whatever they may be, whatever we can look at in the scripture and say, this is what God wants me to do, or this is what God doesn't want me to do. Those things we know. So he says, you want a conclusion to everything with all of the poetry and all of the symbolism and all of the metaphor and all the stuff that he has had to say? How about this? God has given instruction. Why don't you have respect for him, awe and wonder and fear, not in the sense of trembling and being afraid of him because he's mean, but rather I have reverence for him because he is who he is and he's taken the time to instruct me. So let me find out what that instruction is and let me walk in that. So this is man's all. This is really all that man could ever do, is to say there's a God who has communicated, and what he has communicated is useful and good, and I want to be faithful to that. Because he says, because God will bring every work into judgment. Everything produced in the life of a person is going to be examined by him. And he says, he adds this, including every secret thing, even the stuff that people don't see, God does, whether those things are good or bad. So when we stand before him as the one who will ultimately judge all of our work, it's not something, again, to be feared. If we are in that place of having reverence for him and we do those things that he instructs, even if there are those failures along the way, yeah, they're going to be there, but he's not going to be that disappointed parent tapping his feet and telling you how disappointed he is in you. He's going to look at all of the things that we do, even the stuff that everybody else doesn't see. But if we're in fellowship with him and doing as he is instructed, there's no fear. You know, we would love to go back and say, man, I would love to have done that differently. But God's not sitting up there waiting with just a clipboard to tell us about how much of a failure we are. Jesus came, lived, and died and paid for the price of sin so that we could be freed from the consequence of that. So this idea, how I could say to somebody that's, maybe a brand new believer or somebody who's even just thinking about it, there's a lot of things that you could say, and sometimes we complicate it. But I could say very much what Solomon says here as a New Testament Bible teacher. If somebody says, what do you got for me for if you had 15 seconds, I would say God has a lot to communicate to us, and he's done so in his word. Find out who he is and have reverence for him because he's communicated to you, and do the things that he's instructed, because the day's coming when we'll stand before him. Everybody will have to give account for everything that was done openly or even in secret, and God is a judge who sees it all. But we don't have to be afraid of him. If we're busy about keeping the things that he has asked us to do, just rest in that. Recognize that God has called us to do those things. And then, again, rest. The day will come when you'll see him face to face. I look forward to that day. I'll be embraced, and I will embrace him, because that's the promise, not because of, me being better than anyone else or better than, like somehow it's a merit type of a thing. I've been washed and cleansed in the blood of his son. He has provided for me, and when I see my Father face to face, and when I see Jesus, the one who has redeemed me, that's a time of being welcomed home, and all the temporary stuff is done. all the stuff that he talked about, these cycles that people go through, that day's coming to an end sooner or later. And I'm closer to it than I am to my birth. It's just the truth. I'm not troubled by that. It's why I can have just a different attitude. As if I didn't know him, I wouldn't be thinking about this stuff because it would be terrifying to me. But it's not. So just to kind of put a nice fine point on this, and again, I'm not doing a full apologetic thing, but based on what we've read here, I want to remember that the things that Solomon sees as being futile, and this is a good reminder to all of us, the things that Solomon sees as being very much futile, let's remember that this cycle of life and death and the grief that comes from it and all of the sorrow and the pain and the hurt and the injustice and all the stuff that we see in this world that just makes us crazy is not God's original intent. There was never to be death. There was never to be suffering. There was never to be sin. There was never meant to be any of these things. None of this corruption was ever put there. This is not the world that God created in the way that it is now. It's not his intent. It's still here. It's fallen and it's broken, but he's coming to make it new. We just finished in Revelation a couple of months back. And what we read about there is this broken world that we see right now is on a collision course with him. And the day will come when he will judge the world, but he'll come back and he will make something that's different. There will be a major change in what we see as the heaven and earth today. It'll last for 1,000 years. It won't be perfect, but it will be ruled in righteousness, that we know. There will be a rebellion at the end of it. And finally, the last of the things, God will put down the last of rebellion, and we get into a new heaven and a new earth. And in that, there is no corruption. It's brand new. It's made the way that it was supposed to be. And everything is, all that was former is gone. God makes a brand new creation, and it will never fail. So I want to be reminded that this whole cycle of life and death and the corruption that comes with it, it was never his intent. And the idea that he has prepared for those who wait for him and desire that, what he has is an eternity that is going to be the perfection that he had created at Eden, and it will never fail because the ability for that corruption will be done away with. So Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire. There will not be another time. It won't just be waiting for another cycle of things. It will all come to an end and will be gathered to our Creator who created us for much greater things. So I hope that's an encouragement to you. And really, after all the things that we've seen in Ecclesiastes, for him to just basically say, look, here's the summation. Just do as God asked. Have reverence for him. This is the best that man can do, because we'll all stand before him someday. And he'll look at everything that we've done publicly, secretly. It'll all come before him, and he'll give an account, or we'll give an account. He's ultimately the one who will judge between these things, not as an angry person waiting to wipe us out. To those who love him and trust him, though we are imperfect, we await a reward that he has promised to us. Amen to that, right? So we will pick up at Song of Solomon next Monday, and it's a few brief chapters. It won't take long to get through it, and then we're on to the prophets. So I very much look forward to that. I'll explain how we're going to tackle the prophets when we get into the minor ones. Once we get there, we will take the first four, the major prophets, just like they're settled in the text, which is again Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then Daniel. When we get to the minor prophets, Lord tarries, we will handle them in the way of age, because I want to work it around the captivity to the Babylonians. So that'll all make sense. I'll explain it quite a bit more in detail when we get there. So next week, again, starting Song of Solomon. Join us on Thursdays if you haven't already for the Gospel of Matthew. You can pick up with us this week, and if you've missed any of them, everything is there on YouTube. Every book that we've done, all of the studies are there and available. So look forward to sharing any of those studies with you. Hopefully you're joining along. Tell your friends, tell your family, anybody else, if they want to study through the scriptures at their own pace, they can do this as they like. They can download the MP3s through the website. Those are put there. The studies are there. And you can download just the audio if you want to listen to it separately at a different time and not have to sit in front of a computer. So again, any questions, contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and I will look forward to having you with us next week.